Michael Peterson. In 1974, 22-year-old Michael Peterson walked into a post office in Little Sutton, a suburb of Ellesmere Port, with a homemade sawn-off shotgun and robbed it, stealing just £26 and 18 pence before being swiftly apprehended and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Within weeks of arriving at Walton Jail, he attacked 2 prisoners without provocation and was sent to the punishment block, beginning a pattern of violence that would span decades. After repeatedly smashing up workshops, attacking guards, and trying to dig his way out of his cell, prison authorities injected him with the sedative chlorpromazine, which made him violently ill, and in December 1978, after he attempted to end his own life, the now 26-year-old was transferred to Broadmoor Hospital in Berkshire, diagnosed with violent psychopathic disorder. Broadmoor couldn't handle him, and within weeks, authorities transferred him to Rampton Secure Hospital, another maximum security psychiatric facility, where Peterson heard child abuser and murderer John White bragging to other patients about his victims, describing in graphic detail what he had done to the children. Peterson, who had his own twisted moral code, decided White didn't deserve to live, and one day in the common area, he walked up behind White and wrapped his hands around his throat, squeezing until White's breath came out as a death rattle, only stopped when guards burst in and dragged him off the convulsing body. And after this attack, authorities sent him back to Broadmoor. Immediately after arriving at Broadmoor, Peterson attempted to strangle fellow patient Gordon Robinson to death using a silk tie, pulling until the fabric tore apart mid-attack, accidentally saving Robinson's life, and in 1982, protesting his ill treatment, Peterson escaped to Broadmoor's roof and spent 3 days tearing off tiles with his bare hands while family pleaded from below, causing £250,000 in damage. He staged an 18-day hunger strike demanding transfer, and in June 1984, authorities moved him to Ashworth Hospital, where his violent patterns continued, and he perfected his infamous grease attacks, saving up butter portions from meals over days, hiding them in his boxer shorts, and when locked in his exercise cage, he would strip naked and cover his entire body in grease, transforming himself into a slippery nightmare requiring up to 12 officers in full riot gear to subdue in chaotic wrestling matches. His violence inside psychiatric hospitals caused over £350,000 in combined damage across Broadmoor, Rampton, and Ashworth, and when released back to regular prisons in 1987, he embarked on a bare-knuckle boxing career where his fight promoter suggested he change his name to Charles Bronson after the Hollywood action star, continuing his reign of terror for decades and making him Britain's most notorious psychiatric patient turned perpetual prisoner. Graham Young. On September 7, 1947, Graham Young was born in North London, and when his mother died of tuberculosis just 3 months later, his father sent him to live with his aunt and uncle, where he spent his early childhood before being brought back at age 3 to the same house to live with his father's new wife Molly, a separation that caused severe psychological damage. Graham became a peculiar, solitary child with no friends, and by age 13, he had developed an obsession with poisons, convincing local chemists he was 17 to acquire antimony, arsenic, digitalis, and thallium for study purposes. His first victim was schoolmate Christopher Williams, whom Young poisoned with a cocktail that caused weeks of vomiting and cramps. But when Williams wouldn't come to Young's home, where he could observe him, Young shifted focus to his own family, who couldn't escape. By early 1961, Young's father began showing signs of poisoning, followed by his elder sister being poisoned with belladonna in November 1961, and then his stepmother Molly, whom Graham gradually poisoned with antimony until she developed a tolerance. On the night of April 20th, 1962, Young switched to thallium, and the next morning, Molly was found writhing in agony in the back garden with Young watching with scientific fascination. She died that evening in the hospital, with the cause recorded as prolapse of a spinal bone, her body cremated at Young's suggestion with no autopsy. When Young's aunt became suspicious, police arrested the 14-year-old on May 23, 1962, finding vials of poison in his possession. A psychiatrist warned it was extremely likely Young would reoffend, and he was committed to Broadmoor Hospital as the youngest inmate since 1885. Within weeks, fellow inmate John Berridge died of cyanide poisoning, officially recorded as suicide, though Young was suspected. And 10 years later, Young admitted to extracting cyanide from laurel bush leaves in the hospital gardens. Staff later discovered Harpic toilet bleach in a nurse's coffee before she could drink it. And in 1968, 2 packets of sugar soap went missing and were found in the communal tea urn that could have poisoned all 97 staff members. After this incident, Young realized his experiments jeopardized his freedom, so he stopped and became a model patient, attending therapy with enthusiasm, expressing remorse, and reading medical texts that psychiatrists interpreted as academic interest rather than poison study. By the late 1960s, after 2 years of perfect behavior, psychiatrists became convinced he was cured and recommended his release. Just before his release in February 1971, Young told a psychiatric nurse, "When I get out, I'm going to kill 1 person for every year I have been in Broadmoor," and she recorded it in his file. But nobody acted on it. Released at age 23 as fully recovered after serving only 9 years, Young immediately began poisoning again, getting a job at John Hadland Laboratories, where he murdered 2 colleagues with thallium while keeping meticulous diaries documenting exact dosages. When arrested on November 21, 1971, the jury's horror at learning he had been released as cured led to the Arvold Report in 1973, which fundamentally reformed the system for monitoring released psychiatric prisoners. Young died in his cell in 1990 at age 42. Robert Maudsley. Robert Maudsley was born on June 26, 1953, in Speke, Liverpool, the 4th of 12 children, and spent the first 8 years of his life in a Catholic orphanage where he bonded closely with his 3 older siblings and the nuns who cared for them. But when his parents retrieved them at age 8, the abuse began. His father beat him daily with fists, belts, and sticks, once locking him in a room for 6 months where he was beaten 4 to 6 times a day. And his father also sexually abused him. At 16, Maudsley ran away to London, where he got into drugs and worked as a prostitute to survive. In 1974, 21-year-old Maudsley was picked up by 30-year-old John Farrell, who paid for sex but then showed Maudsley photographs of children he had sexually abused. And Maudsley, enraged, garroted Farrell to death and turned himself into the police, saying he needed psychiatric care. He was found unfit to stand trial due to presumed psychosis and sent to Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane. In 1977, while at Broadmoor, Maudsley and another inmate named David Cheeseman took a 3rd prisoner, David Francis, a convicted pedophile, hostage, and locked themselves in a cell with him. They tortured Francis for 9 hours before Maudsley fashioned a weapon by snapping a plastic spoon down the middle to create a sharp point and rammed it deep into Francis's ear, penetrating his brain and killing him. When guards finally broke into the cell, they found the spoon lodged in Francis's skull covered in brain matter, and media reports falsely claimed Maudsley had eaten parts of the brain, earning him the nickname Hannibal the Cannibal, though this was later proven completely untrue. After this incident, Maudsley was convicted of manslaughter and transferred to Wakefield Prison, which he disliked, making it clear he wanted to return to Broadmoor. On one afternoon in 1978, Maudsley killed 2 fellow prisoners within hours. He invited sex offender Salney Darwood to his cell, garroted and stabbed him, and hid his body under his bed, then spent the morning trying to lure other prisoners to his cell, but all refused, with one witness saying they could all see the madness in his eyes. Unable to find willing victims, Maudsley hunted down William Roberts, who was serving time for sexually assaulting a 7-year-old girl, and brutally stabbed him to death, hacking at his skull and smashing his head against the wall. Maudsley then calmly walked into the prison officer's room, placed the dagger on the table, and said, "Next roll call would be too short." After his 3rd and 4th murders, Maudsley demanded to be placed in complete solitary confinement, explicitly stating that if placed in general population, he would continue killing rapists and child molesters. Robert Maudsley has now spent over 47 consecutive years in solitary confinement in a specially constructed glass cell, making him Britain's longest-serving prisoner in solitary. He has refused release offers and in 2000 requested a cyanide capsule to end his existence, which was denied. Peter Bryan. On March 18, 1993, in Chelsea, London, 23-year-old Peter Bryan walked into a Kings Road boutique carrying a claw hammer, high on cannabis, and burning with revenge after being fired for stealing clothes a week earlier. And when 12-year-old Bobby Sheth tried to protect his sister Nisha, Bryan struck him twice in the head with the hammer and knocked him unconscious to the floor. Bryan had fallen for Nisha, the 20-year-old daughter of the shop's owners, while working there as an assistant. But after being caught stealing and fired, something dark inside him snapped, and now he moved toward Nisha, who was chatting on the phone in a different room, and repeatedly hammered her head until she collapsed. Nisha was rushed to Hammersmith Hospital, where she died that evening, and an hour later, Bryan jumped from a third-floor balcony in Battersea in an apparent suicide attempt but survived with broken legs. Bryan was born in 1969 and by his early 20s had developed paranoid schizophrenia with a specific delusional system where he believed certain people were at the lower end of the food chain and should be done away with, but he was incredibly manipulative and able to appear completely normal. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility and was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital in February 1994, locked up without limit of time. But over the next 7.5 years, Bryan played the role of the recovering patient perfectly, attending therapy classes, taking medication without complaint, and speaking with apparent remorse while never once mentioning his delusions. By spring 1999, his doctor at Rampton believed he no longer needed high-security detention, and in June 2001, Bryan was transferred to the John Howard Centre, a medium-security facility, and just 6 months later, in January 2002, he was discharged to Riverside House, a forensic hostel where residents had their own front door keys and could come and go as they pleased. In early February 2004, a 17-year-old girl at the hostel accused Bryan of indecently assaulting her, and when relatives and friends began threatening him, saying they were out to get him, social workers transferred Bryan to an open psychiatric ward at Newham General Hospital for his protection, and after just 1 week, psychiatrists found no signs of mental illness, and on February 17, 2004, discharged him back into the community. Within hours of being freed, Bryan walked straight to a hardware store and bought a claw hammer, Stanley knife, and screwdriver, the same tools he had used 11 years earlier, and he already had a victim in mind. Brian Cherry, a lonely 43-year-old man who lived alone in East London. Shortly after 6 p.m., Bryan knocked on Cherry's door, and when Cherry let him inside, Bryan bludgeoned him with more than 24 hammer blows until his skull was crushed, then dismembered the body like a butcher breaking down meat, severing both arms and one leg, and removed parts of Cherry's brain, fried them in butter on Cherry's own stove, and ate them. When one of Cherry's friends opened the door that evening, he found Bryan shirtless, sweating and holding a kitchen knife, and Bryan calmly told him, "Brian Cherry is dead." And when police arrived and found Cherry's dismembered corpse with his brain tissue sizzling in a frying pan, Bryan told them, "I ate his brains with butter. It was really nice, and I wanted their souls." Bryan was transferred to Broadmoor Hospital on April 15, 2004, where staff documented him as a grave risk to others. But just 10 days later, on April 25, 2004, while staff were on a meal break, Bryan attacked fellow patient Richard Loudwell, aged 60, smashing his head against the floor repeatedly and tying a ligature around his neck. And when staff pulled him off, Bryan said he wanted to eat him. And Loudwell died from his injuries on June 5, 2004. A coroner later described Bryan as chillingly manipulative, and Bryan remains indefinitely detained, with a judge recommending he never be released. Jane Toppan. On July 5, 1901, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 47-year-old Mattie Davis arrived at Jane Toppan's boarding house to collect $500 in overdue rent, and Toppan greeted her with a warm smile and made her a cup of tea while they chatted about the weather and Mattie's family. Over the next 7 days, Mattie drifted in and out of consciousness like a boat tossed on dark waves, her body alternating between periods of strange alertness and deep stupor until she died on July 12th, with Toppan sitting beside her bed, holding her hand. Toppan accompanied the body to the Davis home in Catamet and stood among the mourners with tears streaming down her face, then turned to the grieving family and said, "You had better wait, and in a little while I will have another funeral for you." The family thought grief had made her delirious, so they invited her to move in with widower Alden Davis to care for him in his time of need, and within 40 days, Alden and his 2 daughters, Annie and Minnie, all died under her watch, their deaths following the same pattern of mysterious consciousness fluctuations. By August 1901, suspicious family members demanded authorities exhume the bodies, and toxicologists found traces of morphine and atropine in the tissues. On October 29, 1901, state police arrested Toppan for murder, and during interrogation, the 47-year-old former nurse confessed to killing the Davis family. But as investigators pressed her, the full horror emerged like oil seeping from cracked ground. Toppan was born Honora Kelly in 1854 and had been abandoned to an orphanage before working as an indentured servant to the wealthy Toppan family, and she had trained as a nurse at Cambridge Hospital in the 1880s, where colleagues nicknamed her Jolly Jane for her cheerful demeanor that masked something far darker. She confessed she had been systematically poisoning patients for over 20 years, experimenting with different doses of morphine and atropine, alternating drugs that slowed the body down and sped it up to prolong the dying process and study the effects. Then she revealed what truly drove her. She would climb into bed with her victims as the poison took effect, lying beside them to feel their bodies convulse and grow cold, pressing herself against them as their breathing became ragged, deriving sexual pleasure from watching them die. She confessed to 31 murders, though she told investigators the number could be over 100. On June 23, 1902, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to Taunton State Hospital for life, where she at first maintained her cheerful demeanor. But after 2.5 years, she became disturbed, calling nurses to her cell and whispering, "Get some morphine, dearie, and we'll go out in the ward. You and I will have a lot of fun seeing them die," trying to convince staff to help her poison other patients. She told investigators, "It is my ambition to have killed more people than any man or woman who ever lived." And when asked if she felt guilty, she answered, "I have thought it all over, and I cannot detect the slightest bit of sorrow over what I have done." Toppan died in Taunton State Hospital in 1938 at age 81, having spent 36 years locked up.